Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. I've spent a great deal of time criticising films and the political motives behind the artistic decisions of certain filmmakers. And since it is a new year, I think it is time for something different, a step into an unexplored realm. I shall be discussing my favourite romance film, which also happens to be my favourite Pixar film. I am of course referring to WALL-E, or Waste Allocation Load Lifter Earth Class. Now, apparently Pixar does have a rule against writing romance films, but it is clear to anyone who has seen WALL-E that an exception was made with this story. This film is beautifully and fabulously crafted. As evidence that this is true, I point to CinemaSin's video on WALL-E, where they gave it -5 sins before starting and took away points several times. Even the lap-danced obsessed cynics at CinemaSins have to recognise quality when they see it. I'm going to discuss what I like about the film. I shall start with the characters of the story, and then talk about the themes. Obviously, there will be overlap between these two facets, and I may talk about them both at once. Before we begin, I need to make a statement on terminology. For the purposes of this video, and videos in future, unless otherwise stated, I shall make a distinction between themes and messages. In my view, themes and messages are different. The themes are the subjects, which are explored and discussed in a story, while the messages are the statements the story makes on the subjects. So two films might have societal honour as their subject matter, in other words, both might have the same theme, but have different messages by making different statements on the theme of societal honour. Now that's done, let's begin. Let us start with the protagonist, Wally. He is one of the most interesting protagonists to appear in a Pixar film. All the robot characters use very little dialogue. They are only able to say a few things, such as their name, other characters' names, and a few other lexical words. They almost never use grammatical ones. Thus, Wally expresses himself, using tone of voice and body language. With such limitations, it would not have been an easy task for the animators. Fortunately, the animators at Pixar were/are very talented. Wally is incredibly expressive, and very human, for lack of a better term, despite his metal body. A good thing as well, otherwise it would be difficult for the audience to sympathise with him, and understand what he is thinking or feeling at any given point. Wally is very much an example of the naive, shy, yet friendly character archetype in fiction. When human characters fall into this archetype, mixed reactions sometimes occur. But in this film's case, Wally is more endearing for falling into this archetype, because it makes him the opposite of a robot. Robots are commonly portrayed as cold calculators, who do everything according to a program, and are anything but emotional. An example would be Otto in this film. Wally is an intriguing and interesting character to watch, because he is the opposite of a robot by being a bit childlike. He also has desires and interests, which no robot would be programmed to have. We first see he is a collector, when he enters the container which he lives inside. This is ironic considering that he is a waste disposal robot. His job is to destroy rubbish, not collect it. However, one could easily imagine an actual person doing something like that in this situation, and it helps the audience develop a connection with the character. However, it is the most human desire which really solidifies an audience connection with Wally. Very early on, it is revealed that Wally desires romantic companionship. He wants to hold hands with someone, and we can see him interlocking his hands while watching a romantic musical. He longs to have something similar to what is playing on the screen. Later, as he goes and dusts his bag outside, he looks up, and a gap emerges in the dust clouds. For the first time in the film, the audience gets to see the stars and how polluted the atmosphere is. Wally, upon seeing these stars, plays the romantic song from the previous shots and keeps his gaze fixed on the night sky. Wally doesn't say anything, but what he is doing is clear. He is hoping, wishing, that there is someone for him somewhere out there in the big expanse of the universe. This moment is short, but important for his character development and the audience's understanding of him. The main character's desire for romantic companionship is, in my evaluation, one of the primary reasons Wally struck a chord with audiences across the world. The desire for romantic relationship and company is most natural, and very few can say that they have not desired such things at one time or another in their life. This desire, expressed by the robot Wally, is not only a connection by which we identify with the character, but also a cause for our sympathy. It is hard not to feel any kind of sympathy for Wally, especially when one considers his situation. He is the last robot of his kind on Earth, or on this continent at least. He appears to be on the coast somewhere in North America, and is stuck doing a thankless task, creating skyscrapers of rubbish left by human beings who are either unwilling or unable to fix the mess they themselves created. Wally's only friend is a cockroach, That really is quite sad. Considering all of this, it is easy to understand why any audience would hope that Wally would meet somebody, which of course he does when Eve, or extraterrestrial vegetation evaluator, lands on Earth. By the time Eve lands in the film, the audience has become acquainted with Wally for over 10 minutes. Over these 10 minutes, we quickly realise Wally is anything but a normal robot. In the first 2 minutes we see Eve, we are also shown that the same holds true for her. At first, she acts how we might assume a robot of her design would, but this is whilst the ship, which dropped her off, is still present. Once it leaves, Eve starts flying around the desolate, rubbished wasteland for almost a full minute. She doesn't fly in this scene for any practical purpose. It certainly doesn't help her scan the ground as she was previously doing. She is flying for the joy of it. Later this becomes important in the film, but for the moment it does two things. Firstly, it shows the audience that Eve is like Wally. She isn't merely a robot. She has a personality, and part of that personality is the enjoyment of flying. Secondly, it helps establish an initial connection with the character. The audience already has a connection with Wally because we have seen his loneliness and longing for companionship. In Eve, we see another very human behaviour. Not just the execution of an activity for enjoyment and recreation, but also differing behaviours when in front of her superiors and when by herself. She acts as expected when in front of her superior, the ship which dropped her off, and much differently by herself. This is something an audience member can connect with, even if only subconsciously. Almost everyone on the planet has been in a position in their life where they had to act in what was deemed, rightly or wrongly, an acceptable manner. In certain areas of life, it is not acceptable to show particular facets of your character, whilst in other arenas, those qualities might be the only ones required. One acts differently whilst at work, and differently again with friends and family. Eve understands there are behaviours which are only acceptable in particular social situations. This is a stark contrast between Eve and Wally, because Wally acts as himself in almost every situation. Although he does understand the importance of blending in and acting according to protocol in specific situations to accomplish precise goals, but his social awareness is nowhere near that of Eve's. Eve is trying to find plant life on Earth to discern whether the planet can support human life. This is her directive as a robot, and every robot in the film has a directive. For instance, Wally's directive is to create impressive skyscrapers built of rubbish cubes. She encounters Wally's cockroach pet and seems happy to be amused by it, after she nearly kills it, although she is indifferent to Wally. The audience is shown thrice that she is rather trigger happy. Now this makes little sense from a programming, engineering and design perspective. Why would you create a trigger happy robot and send it to search for plant life on other planets? This would be a disaster waiting to happen. If the Earth had a recovering ecosystem with even a few animal species making a comeback, Puffins for instance, then the robot would likely kill many of them and delay the recovery rate, if not outright extinguish it. At this point in the future of 2810, the Earth and her species need all the help they can get to recover. However, this trigger-happy character trait of Eve, which is played for comedy and becomes convenient from a plot perspective later on, is given a subtle hint of an explanation. At this point in the film, it should be clear that Eve isn't truly robotic. She takes pleasure in flying and emotes happiness when playing with a cockroach, so character traits specific to her are basically confirmed. As she continues her search for plant life, she becomes visibly more frustrated. Then, after being ensnared by a cargo ship's magnet, she loses it. After this destruction, she sits down and becomes rather sad. It is neither shown nor told how many years Eve has been searching for plant life, but it is fair to guess that it has been a long time. Long enough for her to develop a character and personality. The irritation of having to search for something which doesn't want to be found, or doesn't exist, could well explain Eve's tendency to be trigger-happy. This could be the result of irritation and dismay, manifesting itself in a physical character tic. We shall jump further ahead in the film to discuss the few human characters, starting with John and Mary, and finishing with Captain McCree. John and Mary are the prototypical human beings on the Axiom, acting more like robotic drones than real people. When Wally bumps into them, they are both engrossed in the holographic screens in front of their faces. John falls off his hover chair trying to pass his empty cup to Wally, thinking that he is a cup holder robot. He doesn't bother checking if Wally actually is one of these cup robots, and falls onto the ground. Wally then helps him back onto his chair and introduces himself. John seems rather surprised, but happily so, because he is exchanging an actual physical greeting and having a conversation with someone face to face. There is a contrast between the conversation between the different human beings online and yet another one between the interaction between the human beings and the robots. While John was on the floor and asking for help, the robots who were redirecting the traffic ignored him. Wally has not only a face-to-face interaction with John, unlike the other human beings, but also pays attention to his problem, and acts outside of his directive to help him back on his chair. John and Wally have a meaningful interaction. It only lasts a minute, but John seems the better for it. The reaction from Mary when Wally puts an end to her electronic communication with a friend is even more interesting. She is forced to look at the ship with her holographic screen gone, and it appears to have been her first time seeing it. She acts with wonder and amazement upon seeing the main interior of the ship, with its vast size and its flashing advertisements and bright lights. She has a shorter conversation with Wally than John, and stays immersed in the new world she was always moving through. Before Wally leaves her, she discovers the pools in the main plaza, and exclaims,
"I didn't know we had a pool!"
While Wally's interaction with John opened him up to further conversations with entities physically in front of him, Wally opened Mary up to further discovery of the world around her. This later becomes important when Mary, now unplugged from the routine and the technology around her, sees Wally and Eve dancing outside the Axiom. She randomly pulls John out of the passing human beings and tells him Wally is dancing outside. John knows who Wally is and engages in conversation, and they both cheer for him. Mary wouldn't have ever noticed this event if Wally had not destroyed her holographic screen, and John wouldn't likely have been able to engage in a conversation with Mary if he had not had a previous interaction with Wally. This scene establishes the beginnings of a relationship between John and Mary. Now let us move to Captain McCree. While John and Mary were essentially organic automatons, focused on nothing but impersonal conversations on holographic screens, eating and enjoying themselves, Captain McCree actually has a job, and is already unplugged as it were. He only has one job on the ship, and that is the morning announcement. He gets pleasure and fulfillment from doing this simple, almost bureaucratic task. So much so that when he oversleeps until the afternoon, he turns the artificial weather conditions back to morning, and then begins the announcement. He also takes much pride in his title, Captain McCree of the Axiom. While his existence is perhaps a little better than his peers, he is the only human being who seems alive. John and Mary don't have character until Wally arrives, but McCree does have a character. He has a routine, but he doesn't follow it in the same manner as the robots and human beings of the Axiom. Most importantly though, he feels that the human beings on the Axiom are wasting their lives, and he longs for something better than what he has. This desire for something more, his pride of being captain, and his autonomy make him not only human, but also give him the necessary strengths to be a hero towards the end of the film. On the note of being human, we must discuss the antagonist of the film, Otto. Otto is an antagonist, but not a villain. He doesn't have evil motives or evil desires, and doesn't seem to have paid any thought to points on morality or ethics. Why then is he the antagonist? To answer this, a timeline of events must be explained. Before the film begins, mankind became so consumerist that they started to bury their cities in rubbish. So the President of Earth and the BNL megacorporation put into action Operation Cleanup. The operation included the construction of ships like the Axiom to take human beings on a trip around the stars, so the Wally robots could clean the mess up while they were away. The human beings would then return when the rubbish was disposed of and plant life had started to recover on the planet. However, the President sent a message to the autopilots and said that the operation had failed and Earth had to be permanently abandoned. He then gave a directive, Order A113, a recurring Pixar Easter egg. A113 was the order to stay away from Earth and not return for any reason, and to keep cruising around the galaxy. It is Otto's unwavering diligence to this directive that turns him into the antagonist of the story. The reason for the directive was because the President thought there was no hope for Earth. The reason which gave need for the directive is now gone, so there is no need to follow it. Simply put, the President was wrong. Otto is presented such an argument by Captain McCree, but he responds by saying it is
irrelevant, Captain,
and that he
must follow my directive.
When McCree declares that they will be returning to Earth regardless, Otto locks him in his cabin and tries to destroy Wally, Eve, and the plant. Otto doesn't actually wish harm or evil to fall upon the human beings of the Axiom.
On the Axiom, you will survive.
And he doesn't seem malevolent when he imprisons Captain McCree and throws Wally and Eve down the rubbish chute. He is just following his directive, and thus doing what he was designed to do. Now obviously, this kind of behaviour is not something you would expect from a human being, or a penguin, but it is more or less predictable behaviour from a robot designed to follow orders from its superiors, and this is where we delve into the first theme of the film. Number 1. Automation. Wally is anything but an automaton when we find him. Apart from some robotic idiosyncrasies, he is very human. Not least because he is doing things outside of his directive, such as collecting items from the rubbish instead of compacting them. As well as having emotions and emotional states, he also desires romance and company. These are very human traits, and Eve has all of these as well. She does things outside of her directive and has emotions with corresponding emotional states. The only thing Eve doesn't initially have in common with Wally is a desire for romance, but later in the film, when she sees how Wally took care of her while she was in stasis, she develops romantic feelings for him. Wally and Eve are rather different to most of the robots on the Axiom. Apart from Mo, Otto, and a group of dysfunctional robots, all the robots in the film are as you would expect. The humans on the ship might as well be robots, including John and Mary, until Wally interacts with them, as discussed earlier. The human beings on the Axiom appear to be living on repeat, eating, drinking, hologolfing, and relaxing. But most importantly, they are completely oblivious to the world around them, as displayed when Mary is unplugged. Captain McCree even sarcastically states in his very late morning address,
"I'm sure our forefathers would be proud to know that 700 years later we'd be doing the exact same thing they were doing."
While Captain McCree wants to do more and be more, the rest of the human beings aren't even paying attention to his short speech. Much like robots in reality, the human beings are focused on their activities and are seemingly unable to see the world around them, and incapable of comprehending a purpose beyond their programming. And programming is an accurate description of the human beings' routines and way of life on the Axiom, as they blindly follow advertisements without any signs of independent thought.
Stunning. I know, honey. Men.
Attention, Axiom shoppers. Try blue. It's the new red.
Ooh. It is also suggested that they are taught to act like this because of their education, as per this scene where the teacher of the children is a robot.
A is for Axiom, your home sweet home. B is for by and large, your very best friend.
I think an argument could be made that Stanton was trying to make some statements on the current education system in the United States of America. As the film arrives at the Axiom, it is noticeable just how much of an effect Wally has on the robots and human beings on board. Somehow, despite the fact he is a robot, Wally is more human than most of the ship's inhabitants, and able to reintroduce human beings to their own humanity. I've already mentioned how his interactions break John and Mary out of their programming, but he also does similar things to the robots on board. Mo already had a personality when he met him, but Wally's dirtiness is what persuades the miniature robot to break out of his normal line of work, literally, and begin exploring the ship in a quest to remove Wally's dirt. Later, Wally waves at the typing robot called Type. This very simple and friendly physical greeting causes Type to start waving by himself. By the time Wally and Eve leave the office, Type is waving goodbye to them and seems much happier from when we first encountered him. And now we come to the dysfunctional robots. Although they have personality and character because of their humorous defects, they do not have agency, and appear to be content to be repaired and return to their normal robotic status. However, after a misunderstanding, which results in Wally breaking the repair department, the robots rejoice in their independence and break out, clearly decided that it would be much better to be defective than robotic. The film seems to be making statements about how hedonism on autopilot and the mindless execution of tasks isn't ultimately satisfying, and is antithetical to human existence. Indeed, such ways of living are presented as so inhuman that even the robots must break out of them to have any sense of happiness, and as a result become more human, which in a roundabout way brings us back to Otto. The only reason he is an antagonist is because, unlike the other robots in the film, he sticks to his directive and does not do anything outside of it. Everything, literally everything Otto does complies with his directive. He doesn't learn to love like Wally or Eve, he doesn't break out of his literal line of work like Mo, he doesn't even learn to wave. He is an automaton. If he had acted more like the other robots in the film, the story wouldn't have had an antagonist and a final conflict. He can't think outside his directive, similar to how human beings can't perceive the world outside their holoscreens and leisure activities, at least until the end of the film. Number 2. Consumerism. This relates very closely to what I said about automation, so I will try to keep this concise. Early in the film, it is shown to the audience that the reason the Earth is buried in rubbish is because of mindless consumerism. It would appear from the advertisements and the environment that human beings bought vast quantities of goods which they didn't need and couldn't get rid of. This hilarious exaggeration of a consumerist society verges on caricature, but it is deliberate, not only to give the viewer an amused smile or chuckle, but also to point out a problem with consumer habits, namely that Western habit, where people buy tremendous amounts of consumer goods, which they think will make their lives better, only to discover their collections of snow globes and fidget spinners are really rubbish, and yet they are somehow unable to throw these things away, because they believe their lives will somehow be less complete without them. This happens on the internet too. Examples can be found on Steam where gamers will see some games on sale, buy them, and end up not playing most of them. However, the film's caricature of consumerist culture enters its full butterfly from cocoon glory when Wally goes on board the Axiom. On this ship, the audience is introduced to the perfect consumer, the man and woman every company wishes to sell to, the programmed consumer. I don't need to reiterate how the human beings on the Axiom act like robots in the manner they consume products and go about their daily lives. However, I think it is pertinent to note what the men and women of the Axiom don't do as a result of their programming. Because they don't need to work and have been programmed by their environment to do nothing more than consume, they don't create or engage in any activities which would develop either themselves or their environment. There are no sportsmen or artists, no philosophers, no cooks, and certainly no film essayists or critics. The human beings on the Axiom are the perfect consumers, which is great for the company by and large, but terrible for the ship's society. The human beings, by virtue of being the perfect consumers, are also necessarily complete fools. And while I would be the first person to recommend one always be cautious when composing new ideas, philosophies, and art movements to affect social change, I would also be the first to say that any society comprised of thoughtless men will stagnate and be superseded by societies of thoughtful men. And although I dislike a lot of contemporary art, particularly contemporary art which is influenced by postmodernist thought, I do not think it would be advisable to make any laws restricting artistic creation to only classical and neoclassical art. And I say this as an individual who is rather partial towards classical and neoclassical art. It is clear from looking at the populace of the Axiom that these individuals are not contributing anything to the society of which they are part. Although these human beings are free to spend vast quantities of time thinking and producing art, they are doing neither. But what should we expect of them? They have been told, both implicitly and explicitly, that everything they need is provided for by the robots on the ship. If you have everything, why bother creating anything? Besides, creation takes effort, much easier to remain sitting down. It is only during the end credits of the film in which we see the human beings, now back on Earth, repairing and creating. It is only when they are free from the consumerist world of the Axiom, where nothing is simply provided by a robot or a vending machine, that they engage in artistic and technical creativity. To emphasize this flourishing of creativity playing out in snippets on the screen, the art style changes as time progresses. It moves from caveman to impressionist-style paintings. I believe Stanton and the rest of the filmmakers were attempting to tell the audience that consumerist culture is not only messy, but also a hindrance to creativity and human flourishing, and that work isn't something to be shunned and relegated to robots and machines, but rather it can help man develop himself and society. This is not a popular message, particularly not for those stuck in jobs which are either terrible or where the employers are awful people. However, a dismissive attitude to work isn't healthy, nor is the march to automate all industry and replace human workers. Not everyone has an IQ of 120 or above to take the jobs too complicated for computers, and a society comprised of people who cannot find employment is likely to be a stagnant society. Number 3. Environmentalism. I was thinking of not even broaching this theme and the messages made concerning it, because of how politicised the whole debate has become, but it would be dishonest not to talk about this large, pervasive theme. Fortunately, the film doesn't make any overt statements or allusions to global warming, so I can sidestep that thorny debate. However, the film does contain very overt imagery and allusions to pollution and rubbish disposal. And yes, pollution is separate from global warming, but depending on whom you speak to, pollution is responsible for global warming. One of the notable things about the beginning of WALL-E is the setting. A dirty urban environment filled with rubbish and waste. Apart from Wally's pet cockroach, the land is desolate and lifeless. Most cities have trees planted on certain streets, or flowers in gardens, or grass in large parks, but not this one. This might seem like a small point, but WALL-E would be a rather different film, and not just from a plot perspective, but also from a setting and atmospheric one, if there was grass growing on the streets, which has been known to happen in abandoned urban areas. Because of the lifelessness and the rubbish towering above the skyscrapers of the city, one message comes through loud and clear. Mankind screwed up somewhere. Indeed, the president of BNL admits in the video Auto Shows McCree they tried to fix the problem, but Operation Cleanup didn't work. However, the reason for exploring this theme was not to bash people on the head for being bad environmentalists, but instead to act as a warning and a message of hope. Man is shown to have created the problems on Earth, but he is also shown as the only one who can fix them. It is not Wally or Eve who decide to go back to Earth to save the planet and attempt to reinvigorate the environment. It is Captain McCree who decides that they have to go back and try to repair the damage. This is also the moment where Captain McCree realises he has a life mission. Not an easy one, but one ultimately more fulfilling and meaningful than the life he currently leads on the Axiom Bridge. In the ending credits of the film, where plant life is shown returning and the ecosystems recovering, it is depicted with art painting style animation. The impressionist art style at the end, before the rest of the credits begin properly, is rather beautifully done and is reminiscent of Van Gogh's sunflower paintings. Many people are fond of the impressionist art style because of its ability to capture the beauty of the natural environment, and the art movement itself had painters who were admirers of outdoor scenes. Thus, I think the choice of Impressionism in the end credits sequence was to suggest and demonstrate the beauty of outdoor life and the countryside scene, and to suggest that plant life and nature are beautiful and should be valued because they are beautiful. Number 4. Romance and Love. Alright, so before I go into this theme and the comments the film makes upon it, I must address something seemingly obvious, but somewhat important to my analysis. Hold on to your hats, ladies and gentlemen. I said Wally is very much an example of the naive, shy, and friendly character archetype in fiction. I also said when human characters fall into this archetype, mixed reactions sometimes occur. I believe if Wally was a human being in the film, he would not be nearly so endearing, and indeed might be seen as pathetic, undesirable, and even creepy. Why? Well, simply put, if Wally was a human being, he would be a genuinely nice, but desperate guy. I won't go into much detail explaining the alpha and beta spectrum, as it would take much time and plenty of other people have done the job for me. As well, this video will already be controversial enough, with the short explanation I'm about to provide. I shall throw some hyperlinks into the description explaining the concept in more detail. However, if you have heard the phrases or seen the phenomena "nice guys finish last" and "girls always go for jerks," then you already know something about the alpha and beta spectrum. Essentially, an alpha is a man whom women want to either sleep with and/or marry. Thus, an alpha can be anywhere from a dangerous serial killer to a masculine accountant of upstanding moral character. However, it has been argued that alpha males have certain traits in common, such as self-confidence, power, dominance, a sense of purpose, and the capability to be dangerous. The last one may raise eyebrows, but I think there is a reason why there is a phenomenon of women dating criminals or sending love letters to jailed serial killers. And it could also explain 50 Shades of Grey. Nice guys and beta males do not have any of the listed traits, or if they do, they possess them in their least potent forms. But the major ostensible difference between alphas and betas is neediness. I think the world agrees on this fact. If a man is needy towards women, he won't do very well, while if a man doesn't need women, or acts like he doesn't need women at least, he'll do better with them. So having said all this, if Wally and Eve were human beings, Wally would be closer to a needy beta than an independent alpha, and realistically, it would be a little absurd for Eve to be attracted to him by the end of the film. Women are rarely attracted to this type of man. I also think Wally's actions would be interpreted as needy, verging on creepy, rather than sweet or cute by audience members. However, Wally and Eve are not human beings, they are robots, and so Stanton was able to ignore human intersexual dynamics and focus on the nature of love solely. This can be very useful, because when dealing with human romance, there is always, or nearly always, a sexual element, and there is no way to escape this in real life or even fiction. While child-friendly fiction will avoid the overt exploration of the sexual element, you will rarely find a family film where the lovers are grotesque and fat. Grotesque features and fat are not attractive in either of the human sexes, and beautiful personality rarely makes up for horrid physical appearance. A harsh truth to be sure, but again allow me to emphasize rarely. There are exceptions to every rule. However, the sexual element can be completely ignored when your lovebirds are robots. Since they chose to sidestep the more animalistic side of attraction, what are the filmmakers trying to tell us about romance, affection, and love? First, that the desire for romantic company is one of the most natural desires. It is so natural and fundamental to life that robots who acquire sentience long for it. Thus, we see Wally in the beginning of the story, watching the old musical with yearning written in his body language and computer-generated sighs. Indeed, we see this again when John and Mary, effectively broken out of their programming by Wally, are almost instantly attracted to each other. As an aside, considering how indifferent the sexes are to each other in the film, the human species on the Axiom must be propagated by machines and devices, like those described in Brave New World. I can't see the human beings on the Axiom reproducing naturally. John and Mary's budding relationship is played for humour in a way that Wally and Eve's relationship is not. However, this relationship does reinforce the idea that love and romance are natural things, which will develop when individuals are not distracted by the frivolous or unimportant. Second, the film makes an interesting distinction between masculine and feminine beginnings of attraction. Wally and Eve may not be human beings, but Wally is clearly a masculine character and Eve a feminine one. They are referred to with the correspondent gender pronouns in the film and by the filmmakers. For Wally, it is love at first sight, but not so with Eve. While this can be explained as Eve not understanding the concept of love until later in the film because she is a robot, it also does parallel women in that they do not tend to go for a man solely for physical appearance. Later, when Eve watches the security camera footage from when she went into stasis, she is introduced to love by watching Wally's obvious acts of concern fooling her blackout. As seen previously in the film, Wally does everything he can to reactivate Eve and shows concern comparable to that of when an individual finds a friend or relative very ill. These physical acts of concern touch Eve's heart, and this is a turning point as far as the story is concerned, because after this, Eve cares for Wally. Later, Eve shows active physical concern for Wally's well-being. And this brings me to the third message on this theme. Love makes people re-evaluate their priorities, because there is another turning point before the one previously mentioned, which has its payoff in the rubbish department below the axiom. I'm referring to the moment in space just before the defined dancing sequence. Wally presents the plant he has saved from the exploding ship to Eve again. Now, the first time Wally presented the plant to Eve, she took it in a rather dramatic fashion, and then went into stasis. However, this time, Eve takes the plant, then hugs and kisses Wally, thus initiating the heart-warming defined dancing sequence. Eve does multiple things she was not programmed to do, the first of which was not to immediately go into stasis and wait for pickup. The second was hugging and kissing Wally as displays of appreciation, and flying around the ship with him in mutual celebration. Certainly, Eve is warming up to Wally in this scene, but she is still mostly concerned with the plant and presenting it to Captain McCree. She is happier that Wally has helped her move one step closer to fulfilling her directive than with the fact he didn't die in the explosion, although she was very happy to see he hadn't died as well. This scene is set up for a payoff in the rubbish disposal department of the Axiom, where Wally, in a rather terrible state, presents the plant to Eve again. Once again we see Eve's directive play inside her screen. But rather than taking the plant, she throws it away and in no uncertain terms says that Wally is her directive. This is maybe the clearest break from robotic programming in the film, and it is certainly the most heartfelt. The film is telling the audience that love will and should cause individuals to re-evaluate the important things in their lives and place their beloved over life goals. This is illustrated by the scene in question. Throughout the film, Eve has been focused on her directive. Nothing else was ever truly important, but at this moment she says the robot equivalent of, "It's not important, you are." The scene would be very different if Eve took the plant and then left Wally in the garbage. We would say Eve did not love Wally and that she was as cold and hard as, well, a robot. Indeed, the only reason Eve fulfills her directive is because Wally explains it is the only way he can be repaired. Fourth, love is characterized by openness and a degree of vulnerability. Wally does not hide his emotions or affections from Eve, she just doesn't notice them until towards the end of the film. Wally is rather open about his affections, mainly because as a robot he doesn't understand human conventions on courtship, and the only exposure he has had to romance is from an old musical. I am just saying it might not be the best idea to take romantic advice from old musicals. Eve, for her part, is also open about her feelings for Wally, and not just in the garbage disposal department on the Axiom. She shouts with desperation for the plant so she can stop Wally from being crushed. That same voice cries his name as she realises he is still shutting down when he is pulled to safety and the ship is FTL jumping back to Earth. When our heroes arrive back on Earth, Eve hurries to repair Wally. She is visibly sad and upset when she discovers that her efforts have been for naught, because Wally has now reverted to his state of non-sentience and robotic diligence. To love is to be open to pain, especially the pain of seeing your beloved suffer, an accurate assessment and observation in my estimation. Before we leave the subject of the messages and themes and move into the conclusion, there are some things about the topic of love and the film's exploration of it which need attention. Some may well argue that the love portrayed in Wall-E is unrealistic, because no one is capable of this kind of love. Now, personally, I'm not convinced that human beings can't experience love in something akin to the way presented in Wall-E, but even assuming this objection is completely or mostly true, the film's portrayal may not be negative. I think almost everyone can agree romantic love should resemble what is seen in Wall-E, that both parties in the relationship should legitimately care about each other's health and that the relationship should be marked by genuine affection. I believe one of the chief purposes of art is to inspire mankind to higher ideals, to spur individuals towards self-actualization and the pursuit of noble and worthy goals. Thus, I can see the worth in promoting the rather high ideal of love. Perhaps lovers should attempt to emulate this type of love. Maybe if couples did, the divorce rates across the Western world would not be so abysmal. On the other hand, I can see the merits of an opposing argument, that Western art has for years, centuries even, put this type of romantic love on a pedestal and turned it into an idol. And while there may be people who experience this type of love and perhaps can make it work for a lifelong marriage, for most, the magic of love is fleeting. Perhaps, then, art should focus on another portrayal, showing that the more ideal condition is lifelong commitment, where one is obligated to try and generate the feelings if they start to evaporate over time. Maybe there is something to St. Paul's advice to the church in Corinth, where he only recommends marriage as a way of enjoying sexual activities in a moral manner. Never once does he mention romantic love as being a precondition or reason for marriage. I'll be honest, I don't have a definitive answer to any of these questions, and I'm only raising them here so as to provide all my lovely viewers food for thought. Conclusion. So I have talked about both the characters and the way the film approached its chosen themes. I don't have a final overarching point, but I must say that I think WALL-E is great for lessons on how to use characters to explore themes. I think Andrew Stanton thought long and hard about what he wanted to say on the themes in his film, and I think he did an excellent job. I am of course assuming the messages I interpreted from his film are the ones he wanted to send. I could have gotten the wrong end of the stick, but I'm sure I haven't. I also think Stanton and Pixar approached the story topics with maturity and showed great respect to the audience members' intelligence. I respect this. I don't believe a film should screech its messages at the audience. WALL-E is food for thought, and I think for many people it will have influenced their views on nature, love, and what matters in life for the better. Which reminds me, there is another film with at least two of the themes found in WALL-E, a film I don't care for half as much. That film is James Cameron's Avatar. Avatar is a romance film with the same kind of environmental musings as WALL-E. However, when I watch WALL-E, I feel like I am witnessing elegantly and politely worded arguments with live examples and demonstrations to prove the points. Whenever I watch Avatar, I feel as though I've been shouted at by someone lacking important rhetoric skills. If WALL-E is the film equivalent of a thoughtful argument, then Avatar is the equivalent of a cliched slogan. The characters are not easily likable in Avatar, unlike the characters of WALL-E. The exploration of the themes is poorly navigated and lacking tact. The framing of the message is also rather anti-human. WALL-E warns human beings to be careful with the environment, and puts forward the notion that human beings have a responsibility to take care of nature. Avatar, on the other hand, says that human beings are bad for the environment, and have a responsibility to stay away from nature and leave the natives be. On the subject of the alien natives, they are clearly supposed to be an analogy to tribes who live in jungles and rainforests across the globe. And while such tribes do tend to be more in harmony with their habitat than other groups of men, they are not the noble savages Avatar would have us believe. They are very much human and inclined to the same acts of evil as other races. Or, to simplify things, WALL-E. Human beings should be considerate of the environment. Avatar.
Nature good, navigating its offspring, human head bad, modern civilization bad, primitive life good.
Avatar also has romance, but honestly, I don't think it is nearly as deep or compelling as the romance between Wally and Eve. It is an uninteresting execution of a Pocahontas romance. But in short, I think the makers of WALL-E did a good job at making the audience care for the characters and making the audience think about important topics such as romance, life, humanity, and the environment. I think it is an excellently made film. Thank you all for watching. I hope you all have an excellent day. Since we are here, I would like to thank all my subscribers and viewers for giving me 1 million views on my military analysis of The Last Jedi. Thank you so much. Oh, and since we are on the subject of military analysis videos, I am currently working on another military analysis video.